So we need to talk about the general Greek temple plan, because as we move into the Archaic, we're going to see more and more surviving temples, and they follow certain basic rules most of the time. So this is very important. I'm going to be going over some terms and ideas, so you will want to take notes, although some of these slides can easily be printed and you can take notes on them fairly easily from there. The Greek temple is basically very similar to a Mycenaean megaron. And what we're looking at is a couple of key elements that I want you to know. You don't need to know all of this. First of all, in the center, you have a cella. This is the area where we're going to see worship taking place, and it's always the priest, not the public. You also have to know the colonnade, which is this area between the temple, the cella, and the columns running around the outside. Then we have the stylobate. The stylobate is the level that the columns are sitting on and that the cella is sitting on. It's sort of the top step for this temple. And those steps, you'll notice there's usually only 2 or 3 running all the way around the temple. Now, there are 2 kinds of temples that we'll generally be dealing with. One is Doric and one is Ionic, and I won't be testing you on them, but they are useful to know the terms. So the easiest way to look at them is look at the columns. This is a Doric column. It has no base. This is an Ionic column, and it does have a base. The other thing to look at is the Ionic has a frieze right here, which would be a continuous sculpture running across this level of the temple, whereas the Doric has a series of metopes separated by triglyphs, and it acts sort of like a comic strip where you read one box and then you read the next box. Up here, this triangle, this is the peristyle, and you're going to see a lot of sculpture up there. So this brings us to the columns. In the old days, or the 90s, they used to make us memorize these. I no longer make students memorize these. The Doric is the first form of column. It looks a lot like the Minoan column. If you take that bulbous capital that the Minoans had and kind of crunch it down a little bit, you get the Doric. You'll notice there's no base. It's also wider than the other 2. The Ionic has 2 sides that are identical. So this side and the back side are identical, and then the left and right side are identical. But it's not identical on 4 sides, only on 2. And it has a base. The Corinthian is a much later column. It's something we won't see until the Hellenistic. And there we have a capital that's identical on all 4 sides. It's generally much more ornate, and it has a base. We won't worry about those in terms of memorization. Now, how are they built? Well, these columns are built in individual drums. The reason is it's almost impossible to try and transport something that's, say, 60 feet tall of marble and made of marble. It would be incredibly difficult. Even today, we would have a hard time doing it. So they break it down into a series of drums. Each drum has a hole created in the middle of it. That square hole would have a square wooden tube inserted. In other words, a piece of wood that's square to fit the hole and then drilled out in the center so that it will disintegrate over time. If it were solid, if any moisture got in there, it would actually expand and break the column. But that's necessary to align the columns so that the fluting always lines up. And to give you an idea how difficult this is, if you've ever worked with railroad ties or heavy stones for landscaping, imagine what happens when you get just one stone between 2 of these pieces. It's going to roll around, it's going to become uneven very quickly. So you need that square peg to line everything up just in case something gets in there, or for example, the drum is a little bit more convex than you would like. Now, there's different styles of temple. We're not going to worry about most of them. What I want you to look at is this series down here. And look at the overall ratios. We go from a 1 to 3. Making dots is tricky here. A 1 to 3 ratio to a 1 to 2 ratio. We'll do it that way. And 1 to 3 means that I have 1 width, and then the length is 3 times the width. Here, I have the width and then a length that is twice that. And what they're doing is they're trying to create something that's closer and closer in proportion to the human body. And the proportion of the human body is 1 point, wow, something went nuts, 1.618 to 1. 1.618 to 1 is the ratio, for example, the knuckles on your fingers, the proportions of the length to the width of your lips, of your eyes, the position of your nose, etc. It's a figure that exists throughout nature. It comes in part from the Fibonacci sequence and some other places. But what they're trying to do is create a perfect temple, and to them the perfect form is the human form, because humans are depicted in the form of the gods. So therefore, the closer the temple gets to human proportions, the closer it gets to a perfect gift for the gods. And these temples are going to include a lot of sculpture. Frequently sculpture on the pediments. Sorry, I said peristyle earlier. This is the pediment. Up here, the triangular piece above the temple. We're going to see a lot of sculpture there. We're going to see sculpture throughout the temple. And that's there to give a sense of an offering to the gods. It's also going to tell us stories about the god that the temple is dedicated to. The building itself is conceived of as sculpture meant to evoke a human response. And when they actually use it, you would not enter the temple itself. Only the priests would enter the temple. Instead, there's an altar on the outside, usually on the east side of the temple, where animals would be sacrificed and where you could talk to the god. And then the priests would do the actual entering. Inside, there's usually a massive sculpture, which we see back here, which is a cult statue. And this is the statue of the god that's being worshipped at that temple. And these temples should be understood as gifts to the god, not houses for the god. The god is not understood to exist in this temple. This temple is an offering, so it's a very different idea than our current idea of churches. And these generally were brightly painted. So we see sculptural ornament, which is concentrated at the top of the building. We see the building probably covered in murals, as we see here, and painted in these bright primary colors. The idea is you want it to be seen from a great distance. And oftentimes, these colors are incredibly valuable, such as blue would be very valuable. So they would use it on the temple regularly to show off, just like some of those religious figures that we've seen where they're using materials like gold or semi-precious stones. There is no structural function to the painting. The painting generally is there to not only worship the god, but also to set off the architectural details so that you can see everything. And yes, all of the Greek statuary that we know of as white and gleaming would have been painted. None of it would have been left white. And these temples, just to give you an idea, would have been quite gaudy today. A little too far. would have been quite gaudy today. So you would look at it and it would strike you more as a circus piece than it would as a temple as such. But it's a very different time period, and they look at religion very differently, as we'll see.